White police officer humiliates young barber, but didn't know his daughter was with. Brandon Walker moved the comb in one hand, the scissors in the other, his motions fluid and precise. Each snip seemed intentional, almost like an artist crafting his signature. At just 19, Brandon was the proud owner of his own barbershop, a dream he'd clawed his way to achieve. The shop had a timeless charm, with its exposed brick walls and vintage chairs, a haven for people seeking more than just a haircut. They wanted connection. Jason Miller, Brandon's best friend and now co-worker, leaned against the counter, flipping through the schedule on the shop's tablet. "You got any open slots this afternoon?" Jason asked casually, though his tone carried a hint of something else. Brandon glanced at him and smirked. "A couple." "Why?" "Someone special coming in." Jason shrugged, his face carefully neutral. "Heard some of the precinct guys might swing by. Thought I'd give you a heads up." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Cops? That's not exactly your regular crowd. You nervous?" "Nah, just figured you'd want to know," Jason replied, though he avoided meeting Brandon's gaze. "All right, just another day, right?" Brandon said with a light laugh, brushing off Jason's subtle tension. But Jason's expression lingered in the back of his mind as Brandon returned to his work. He didn't press the issue, unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing. The chime above the door jingled, pulling Brandon's attention. In walked a man who carried himself like he owned the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a crisp police uniform. His badge gleamed under the overhead lights, Officer Richard Thompson. The air seemed to tighten the moment he stepped inside. Brandon approached him with his usual welcoming demeanor. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you today?" "Haircut." "Make it quick," Thompson replied, his voice sharp and clipped. Without waiting for a reply, he sank into the chair like he was sitting on a throne. Brandon nodded and draped the cape around him, keeping his tone polite. "You got it. Let me know if there's anything specific you want." Thompson grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the shop's interior with mild disdain. Brandon noticed the subtle curl of the man's lip, like he was already judging everything about the place. Brandon pushed the thought aside and focused on the job. The officer's silence was heavy, but Brandon was used to filling the quiet. "Busy day at the precinct?" he asked, trying to keep the mood light. Thompson's gaze flicked up to meet Brandon's in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "Busy enough. Just do your job." The response made Brandon's hands tighten briefly around the comb. He nodded once and continued the cut, channeling his frustration into precision. For a while, the snipping of scissors was the only sound. But Brandon could feel the weight of Thompson's critical eyes following his every move. It was unnerving, like being scrutinized under a microscope. Then it happened, a slight slip, no more than a fraction of an inch. A line came out shorter than intended. Brandon froze, his stomach dropping. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "What did you just do?" Thompson's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Brandon stepped back, hands raised. "It's just a small mistake, sir. I can fix it. Give me a second." Thompson's face darkened as he turned his head toward the mirror. "Fix it? You already screwed it up." His voice boomed, drawing the attention of everyone in the shop. Jason straightened from where he'd been leaning, his expression guarded. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between the two men. "I'm really sorry," Brandon said quickly. "I'll make it right. Just... You think you can make it right? This is what happens when they let anyone run a business these days," Thompson sneered, standing abruptly and pulling off the cape. Brandon's face burned with humiliation, but he held his ground. "Sir, I didn't mean." "Spare me the excuses," Thompson interrupted, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled bill and tossed it onto the counter. "You're lucky I don't report this. Unbelievable." With that he stormed out, leaving the bell above the door ringing in his wake. The room was deathly quiet for a moment, save for the faint hum of the clippers Brandon had hastily turned off. Jason crossed the room and clapped a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Don't let it get to you, man. Some people just look for a reason to tear others down." Brandon forced a tight smile, though his hands were still trembling. "I'm fine," he lied, picking up the broom to sweep the scattered hair on the floor. His pride felt shattered, but he refused to let it show. The shop slowly returned to life as Jason and the other barbers resumed their work, but Brandon remained quiet, his mind replaying the incident over and over. He could still feel Thompson's accusing gaze, still hear the venom in his words. Jason leaned over as they prepared to close for the night. "You sure you're okay?" "Yeah," Brandon said, his voice hollow. "Let's just finish up." But as the shop emptied and the lights dimmed, Brandon sat alone in one of the vintage chairs, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The day's events hung heavy over him, a weight he couldn't shake. He let out a slow breath, gripping the edge of the chair. "It's just one bad day," he told himself. But deep down, he knew this was far from over. Betty Thompson stood in front of the mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the neckline of her dress for the 10th time. At 18, this moment felt monumental. It wasn't just about meeting her parents, it was about introducing Brandon to them. Her father's approval, or lack of it, loomed heavily in her mind. Jessica Collins, her best friend, lounged on the bed, watching Betty with a mixture of amusement and concern. "You're overthinking it," Jessica said. "He's a great guy. Your parents will see that." Betty shot her a look in the mirror. "You don't know my dad like I do. He's particular." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Particular? That's one way to put it. Controlling is another." Betty sighed. "I just need tonight to go smoothly. If Dad sees how much Brandon means to me, maybe he'll—" "Relax," Jessica interrupted, standing to place a reassuring hand on Betty's shoulder. "It'll be fine. You're strong, and Brandon's amazing. They'll come around." Betty nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right. I've got this." The restaurant was quiet and elegant, the kind of place Richard Thompson insisted on for family dinners. Betty arrived early, her nerves fraying as she glanced at the door every few seconds. She fiddled with her phone until her mother's voice pulled her back to the moment. "Betty, you look stunning," Sarah Thompson said warmly as she approached the table, wrapping her daughter in a hug. Sarah's kind eyes scanned Betty's face. "You're nervous." "I'm fine," Betty replied, though her tight smile betrayed her. "Where's Dad?" "Running late, as usual," Sarah said with a roll of her eyes. "He'll be here soon." They took their seats, Sarah launching into a light-hearted story about her day. Betty listened absently, her eyes still fixed on the door. When it opened, her heart skipped a beat as Brandon walked in. He was dressed impeccably in a dark blazer, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced with a stiffness that made Betty's heart ache. She stood to greet him, her smile easing his tension slightly. "You look beautiful," Brandon said softly, taking her hand. "And you look nervous," she teased, her voice low. "Should I be?" he asked, glancing toward her mother, who was already rising to greet him. "Mom, this is Brandon," Betty said. "It's lovely to meet you," Sarah said warmly, extending a hand. "Betty's told me a lot about you." "All good things, I hope," Brandon said with a polite smile, shaking her hand. "Of course," Sarah replied, her voice genuine. "Let's sit. Richard should be here any minute." The door opened again, and in walked Richard Thompson. His commanding presence immediately drew attention from the other diners. Spotting Betty, his expression softened, but the moment his eyes landed on Brandon, it hardened like stone. His jaw clenched visibly as he approached the table. "Dad." Betty greeted him with a smile, standing to hug him. "There's my girl," he said, his tone warm for her. But his eyes flicked back to Brandon, narrowing in recognition. "You." The single word came out like a growl, freezing the table. Betty blinked, caught off guard by the sudden hostility. "Dad?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "Wait, you know Brandon?" Richard ignored her, his focus locked on the young man who had stood respectfully as he approached. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Brandon's throat tightened, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Sir, I didn't realize you were Betty's father. And you thought that made this okay?" Richard's voice was low, almost a snarl. "My daughter, dating a—" "Dad, stop," Betty interrupted, her cheeks flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "Brandon is my boyfriend. You can't just—" "Boyfriend?" Richard cut her off, his voice rising. Heads turned from nearby tables. "Betty, you're better than this." "Better than what?" Betty shot back, her voice trembling. "Better than someone who's kind? Who works hard? Who actually makes me happy?" "Richard," Sarah interjected, her tone firm but calm. "This isn't the place." Brandon stepped forward, his hands at his sides, though tension rippled through his body. "Sir, I care deeply about your daughter. I'd never do anything to hurt her." Richard turned his glare on Brandon. "You think this is about you hurting her?" It's about what's best for her. And you? You're not it. Betty's voice cracked as she spoke. Dad, you're being unfair. Unfair. Richard scoffed. Let's not pretend this is serious, Betty. You'll thank me later when you realize he's not worth your time. Brandon's fists clenched briefly, but he released the tension, forcing himself to stay composed. I think it's best if I leave, he said quietly, turning to Betty. I'm sorry. No, Brandon, wait, Betty pleaded, reaching for his hand. But he gently pulled away, meeting her eyes with a look of quiet devastation. Betty, let him go, Richard said coldly. He doesn't belong here. Brandon didn't look back as he walked toward the exit, each step heavy with humiliation and heartbreak. The door closed behind him, leaving an unbearable silence at the table. Betty turned to her father, her eyes blazing with anger and tears. How could you? She demanded. Betty, Richard began, but she cut him off. No, she said, her voice shaking. I'm done letting you control my life. Sarah placed a hand on Betty's arm, her voice soft but firm. Let's all take a moment to calm down. But Betty shook her head, grabbing her bag. I need some air. Without waiting for a response, she followed Brandon's path, leaving her parents alone at the table. Richard sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. Sarah watched him for a moment before speaking. You're going to lose her, Richard, she said softly. And when you do, it'll be your fault. Richard didn't respond. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. The fallout from the dinner lingered like a storm cloud over Brandon and Betty's relationship. The tension between them wasn't born from their feelings for each other. They both knew those were strong. Instead, it was the relentless interference of Richard Thompson, Betty's father, that weighed heavily on them. For Brandon, the days that followed were grueling. The barbershop, once his sanctuary, began to feel like a stage where he was constantly being watched and judged. Every time a police car slowed down in front of the shop or an officer stepped inside, he couldn't help but wonder if it was Thompson pulling strings, orchestrating more ways to remind him of his place. One morning, Jason found Brandon in the back room, sitting on a crate with his head in his hands. Hey, you okay? Jason asked, closing the door behind him. Brandon looked up, his eyes tired. Not really. Jason sat down across from him, waiting. Brandon finally spoke. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Thompson's everywhere. It's like he's just waiting for me to slip up, to prove I'm not good enough. You're letting him get in your head, man, Jason said. You're better than that. Brandon let out a bitter laugh. Am I? He's a cop, Jason. He has power, real power. I'm just a barber. Jason leaned forward, his voice firm. You're more than that. Don't let one guy make you forget it. That evening, Brandon sought out the one person he trusted to give him clarity. Samuel Brooks, the old barber who had been his mentor. Samuel's shop was smaller, quieter, tucked away in a part of the city where Brandon had spent his teenage years learning the trade. The familiar sound of scissors snipping greeted him as he walked in. Samuel looked up from his client and gave a knowing nod. Brandon. Sit tight. I'll be with you in a minute. Brandon sat on the worn leather couch in the corner, the smell of aftershave and talcum powder calming his frayed nerves. When Samuel finished his client, he waved Brandon over to the barber chair. Talk to me, Samuel said, leaning on the counter. Brandon hesitated, staring at his hands. It's Betty's dad. He's making my life hell. Samuel's brow furrowed. What's he doing? Brandon explained everything. The dinner, the harsh words, the subtle ways Thompson was exerting his influence, and the toll it was taking on him. Samuel listened intently, his face a mask of thoughtful calm. I don't know how much more I can take, Brandon admitted. I love Betty, but her dad, he's everywhere. Samuel crossed his arms, his voice steady. Do you love this girl? More than anything, Brandon said without hesitation. Then don't let one man scare you off, Samuel replied firmly. Richard Thompson doesn't get to decide your worth. That's on you. Brandon looked up, his eyes searching. But what if I can't prove it? What if he's right? Samuel shook his head. You don't need to prove anything to him. You need to prove it to yourself. You've already come so far, Brandon. Don't let his words make you forget who you are. Meanwhile, Betty was waging her own battle at home. She confronted her father in the living room one evening, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Why do you hate Brandon so much? She demanded, crossing her arms. Richard Thompson barely looked up from the newspaper he was reading. Hate? Don't be dramatic, Betty. I don't hate him. I just know he's not right for you. Betty stepped closer, her tone sharper. Why? Because he's a barber? Because he didn't grow up in some perfect neighborhood? Or is it because he doesn't fit your idea of good enough? Richard lowered the paper, his face hardening. You don't understand. I've worked my whole life to give you opportunities, to protect you from making mistakes. Mistakes? Betty's voice rose. Falling in love with someone who's kind, who works harder than anyone I've ever met, who makes me feel alive, that's a mistake? You're young. You don't see the bigger picture, Richard shot back. He's not your future. No, Dad, she said, her voice trembling with frustration. You don't see the bigger picture. You're so focused on controlling everything, on protecting this image of what you think my life should be, that you can't see what actually makes me happy. Richard stood, his voice rising. You think happiness is enough? Life isn't just about feelings, Betty. It's about stability, respect, a future. And Brandon doesn't deserve that? Betty challenged, her voice breaking. Because he doesn't wear a badge like you? Because he didn't have the privileges you had? Richard's silence was deafening. He turned away, his jaw tight. Betty shook her head, tears threatening to spill. You're not protecting me, Dad. You're pushing me away. Later that night, Betty called Brandon, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. I'm sorry about everything, she said. My dad, he's stubborn. He doesn't see you the way I do. It's not your fault, Brandon said, though his voice was just as strained. You shouldn't have to fight for us like this. Betty hesitated. Do you want to end this? The question cut through him like a blade. No, he said quickly. But I don't want to make your life harder. You're not, she said firmly. My dad is. And I'm not letting him win. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their circumstances hanging between them. I love you, Betty whispered. That hasn't changed. I love you too, Brandon replied. But I don't know how much longer I can hold on. As the days dragged on, Brandon tried to take Samuel's advice, pouring himself into his work and refusing to let Thompson's presence dominate his thoughts. But the strain was undeniable. Each time Betty confronted her father, each time Brandon saw a squad car slow outside his shop, the cracks in their resolve deepened. Something had to give, but neither of them was ready to admit what it might cost. Brandon sat alone in his dimly lit barbershop long after closing, his elbows resting on the counter, his hands clutching his head. The echoes of their last conversation replayed in his mind like a cruel loop, each word cutting deeper than the last. Betty's voice had been trembling, her tears barely hidden as she uttered the words that neither of them truly wanted to say. I think we need to take a break, she had said softly, her eyes locked on the floor. Betty, please, Brandon had started, but she held up a hand, her face breaking with sorrow. This isn't about how I feel about you. It's about everything else. My dad, the constant pressure, the fights. It's all too much. And it's not fair to you. Her words felt like a hammer to his chest, leaving him breathless. You're giving up, he whispered, his voice cracking. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm trying to save us. If we keep pushing like this, we'll break for good. I need time to figure out how to deal with him, and how to fight for you without losing myself. The conversation had ended with a hug that felt more like a goodbye. Now, in the silence of the shop, Brandon couldn't stop himself from reliving the way she had looked at him, like she was walking away from a part of herself, not just from him. The days that followed were empty in a way Brandon had never experienced. Cutting hair had always been his escape, the rhythm of his craft grounding him. But now, every snip of the scissors, every hum of the clippers felt hollow. The clients kept coming, but the pride he usually felt in his work was gone. Jason noticed. You're not yourself, man, he said one afternoon as they closed up. I'm fine, Brandon replied, sweeping the floor with mechanical precision. No, you're not, Jason pushed. You're going through the motions, but your heart's not in it. What's going on? Brandon stopped, leaning on the broom. It's Betty, he admitted. We broke up. Jason's face softened. I'm sorry, bro. I know how much she means to you. Brandon nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. It wasn't just about us. Her dad. He's always there, always in the way. She said she needed time to figure it out. And what about you? Jason asked. What do you need? Brandon shrugged. I don't even know anymore. That evening, Brandon visited his mother, Linda Walker. She was in the kitchen when he arrived, cooking with the kind of ease that had always comforted him. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, wiping her hands on a towel as he walked in. But her smile faded when she saw the exhaustion in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Brandon sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain. "Betty and I broke up." Linda sat across from him, her expression soft but steady. "I'm sorry, honey. Do you want to talk about it?" She said it's because of her dad, because of everything he's done to make this harder for us, Brandon said, his voice low. She said she needed time, but it feels like she's just done. Linda reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I know how much you care about her. But right now, it sounds like you're carrying too much of the weight." Brandon met her eyes, searching for some kind of answer. "What am I supposed to do? I can't stop loving her." "I'm not saying you should," Linda said gently. "But you can't lose yourself in the process. You've worked so hard to get here, Brandon. Don't let him, take that away from you." Brandon exhaled shakily. "How am I supposed to focus on anything else?" "You need to remember why you started," Linda said firmly. "You didn't open that barbershop just for the sake of it. You did it for you, for the life you wanted to build. Maybe it's time to pour yourself back into that." The next morning, Brandon arrived at the shop earlier than usual. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just going through the motions. He reorganized the tools, polished the chairs until they gleamed, and even took the time to adjust the lighting, giving the shop a fresher, warmer feel. By the time his first client walked in, Brandon was ready. He greeted them with a genuine smile and found himself sinking into the rhythm of his work. For those moments, his mind quieted, and the weight on his chest lightened. Word of Brandon's skill had already spread, but as his focus returned, so did his reputation. Clients began leaving rave reviews, praising not just his precision but the welcoming atmosphere of his shop. One client, a local journalist, even asked if he could write a feature about Brandon's journey from a struggling teenager to a young business owner. Brandon hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. "Maybe it's time to tell my story," he thought. As the shop gained momentum, Brandon started thinking about ways to give back. He remembered what Samuel Brooks had taught him, how learning the trade had given him purpose when he felt aimless. Inspired, he reached out to Samuel and proposed an idea, offering free classes to young people interested in barbering. "It's ambitious," Samuel said when they met to discuss it. "But I like it. If anyone can pull it off, it's you." Brandon felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in weeks: pride. For the first time since the breakup, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. But even as Brandon threw himself into his work, Betty was never far from his thoughts. Every time the bell above the shop door rang, a small part of him hoped it would be her. But she didn't come. Late one night, as he locked up, he stood in the doorway for a moment, staring out at the empty street. "I'm doing this for me," he reminded himself. But in the quiet, he couldn't shake the ache of missing her. Brandon had just finished sweeping the last of the clippings off the shop floor when the door opened, and a tall figure ducked inside. The man was instantly recognizable: Marcus Bryant, the professional basketball player whose face adorned billboards and magazine covers across the country. Brandon blinked in surprise. "Marcus Bryant," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What brings you here?" Marcus grinned, his easy charm filling the room. "Word on the street is you're the guy to see if I want the best cut in Chicago." Brandon straightened, trying to suppress the excitement bubbling in his chest. "Well, I'll do my best to live up to the hype. Take a seat." As Marcus settled into the vintage barber chair, Brandon grabbed his tools, his movement steady but his mind racing. This was an opportunity he couldn't afford to mess up. "So what are we thinking?" Brandon asked, running a comb through Marcus's hair. "Clean fade, sharp lines," Marcus replied. "You know, something that says I've got game, but also I mean business." Brandon chuckled. "Got it. Leave it to me." The two fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. Marcus asked about the shop's history, and Brandon told him about the struggles of opening it and the pride he felt in building something from the ground up. Marcus listened intently, occasionally nodding and offering words of encouragement. "This place has a vibe," Marcus said, looking around the shop. "It's more than just a barbershop. Feels like home." Brandon smiled, his confidence growing. "That's what I was going for." A place where people can come, relax, and feel like they're part of something. You nailed it, Marcus said, leaning back as Brandon worked. When Brandon finished, Marcus checked himself in the mirror, a wide grin spreading across his face. Man, this is clean. You're a magician. Just doing my job, Brandon said modestly, though he couldn't hide the pride in his voice. Marcus pulled out his phone. Mind if I post about this? People need to know where the magic happens. Brandon's heart skipped. Are you serious? Dead serious, Marcus said. You deserve the recognition. The post went live that evening, a series of photos and a caption that read, "Shout out to Brandon Walker at Walker's Barbershop. Best cut in the city, hands down. If you're not coming here, you're missing out." Marcus's millions of followers took notice, and the effect was immediate. The next morning, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Walk-ins filled the shop before Brandon even flipped the open sign. Jason leaned against the counter, watching the chaos with wide eyes. You didn't tell me we'd become a celebrity hotspot overnight. Neither did I, Brandon replied, juggling clients and calls. By the end of the week, the shop was bursting at the seams. Brandon knew he needed more space, more staff. He reached out to Samuel Brooks, asking if he'd be willing to come on board as a mentor to new hires. You're really making waves, Brandon, Samuel said during their conversation. It's inspiring to see. As Brandon's success grew, so did his reputation. Local newspapers wrote articles about his journey, and the barbershop became a cornerstone of the community. But even in the whirlwind of his achievements, there was one thought Brandon couldn't shake: Betty. He caught himself checking his phone late at night, scrolling through messages they'd shared or staring at her contact photo. He didn't reach out, unsure if she even wanted to hear from him. But part of him hoped that somehow, she was watching. Miles away, Betty was watching. She saw the posts, the articles, the glowing reviews about Brandon's shop. Each one filled her with a bittersweet mix of pride and longing. She had always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. Now, seeing him thrive, she couldn't help but wonder if there was still a place for her in his life. One evening, she sat on her bed, her phone in her hands. Jessica sat beside her, glancing at the screen. You're going to text him, aren't you? I don't know, Betty admitted, biting her lip. Jessica gave her a knowing look. You miss him. Of course I do, Betty said softly. But what if he's moved on? What if he doesn't want to hear from me? Jessica shook her head. Betty, you'll never know unless you try. And from what I can see, you are always the one thing he'd never move on from. Taking a deep breath, Betty typed a message. Congratulations on all your success. You deserve it. She hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity before finally pressing it. Brandon was in the shop, cleaning up after another long day, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. Betty's name lit up the display, and his chest tightened. Swiping to open the message, he read it twice, his heart racing. Without overthinking, he replied. Thank you. It means a lot coming from you. Moments later, her next message arrived. Could we meet? Just to talk. Brandon stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Finally, he typed, when and where. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, the same one where they had shared so many conversations in the past. Brandon arrived early, nervous energy buzzing through him as he waited. When Betty walked in, he felt his breath catch. She looked the same, beautiful, confident, but with an air of hesitation he hadn't seen before. Hi, she said, stopping in front of his table. Hey, Brandon replied, standing to pull out her chair. Still a gentleman, she teased, though her smile was soft. Brandon sat across from her, unsure where to start. Betty broke the silence. You've done incredible things, Brandon. I've been following everything. Thanks, he said, his voice steady but cautious. I couldn't have done it without what you taught me. She tilted her head. What I taught you? You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, he admitted. That stuck with me. Betty looked down, her fingers playing with the edge of her napkin. I should have fought harder for us. I let him get in my head. It wasn't just you, Brandon said quickly. We were both trying to carry too much. Her eyes met his. Do you think we can try again? Before he could respond, the door to the cafe opened, and a familiar figure walked in. Richard Thompson. The air seemed to freeze as their eyes locked. Brandon's heart skipped a beat when the cafe door opened, and Richard Thompson stepped inside. The man's presence was as commanding as ever, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Betty and Brandon at the corner table. The muscle in his jaw tightened, and his stride quickened. Betty saw him a moment later, her face tightening. "Dad," she muttered under her breath, straightening in her chair. Richard reached their table, his expression unreadable but his voice low and tense. "Betty, we're leaving. Now." "No, Dad," Betty said firmly, her voice steady. "I'm staying." Richard's gaze shifted to Brandon, his disdain unmistakable. "So this is what you're doing? Sneaking around with him behind my back?" "Dad, this isn't sneaking around. I'm an adult." "I don't need your permission," Betty shot back. "Adult?" Richard's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "Acting like an adult would mean making smart decisions, not wasting your time with." "Stop," Betty interrupted, her voice sharp. "I'm done listening to this. You don't get to decide who I care about, and you don't get to treat Brandon like he's beneath us." "Beneath us?" Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. "I've spent my entire career protecting people, providing for this family. I know what's best for you." "No, Dad, you know what's best for you," Betty countered. "You're so obsessed with control that you can't see how much you're hurting everyone around you." Brandon sat silent, his hands clenched beneath the table. He wanted to defend himself, to stand up to Thompson, but he knew this wasn't his moment. This was Betty's fight. "Hurting everyone?" Richard retorted. "I've done nothing but protect you, Betty. From people like him." Finally, Brandon couldn't hold back. "With all due respect, sir, people like me? What does that even mean?" Richard's eyes snapped to Brandon, cold and hard. "It means you're not good enough for her. You can't provide for her, can't give her the life she deserves." Brandon's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "And what kind of life is that? One where she's constantly afraid of disappointing you? Where she has to choose between her family and her happiness?" "Don't lecture me," Richard growled. "You don't know anything about responsibility or sacrifice." "Enough." Betty's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. "Both of you stop. Dad, I love you, but I'm not a child anymore. And I love Brandon. You don't have to like it, but you need to respect it." Richard's face reddened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But before he could say another word, the door opened again, and Sarah Thompson walked in, her eyes immediately locking on the scene. "What's going on here?" Sarah asked, her tone even but firm as she approached the table. "Your daughter is making a mistake," Richard said, his voice brimming with frustration. "And this boy is encouraging it." Sarah's expression hardened. "Richard, enough. You've been pushing her away for months, and if you keep this up, you're going to lose her for good." Richard faltered, his bravado cracking under Sarah's steady gaze. "I'm trying to protect her," he said, though the words sounded hollow. "Protect her?" Sarah echoed. "From what? From someone who loves her? From someone who makes her happy? Or is this about your pride, Richard? Because I don't see anyone else who needs protecting here." Betty stepped closer to her mother, her voice softening. "Mom, thank you. But I need to handle this." Sarah nodded, stepping back. "I'm here if you need me." Betty turned to her father, her eyes filled with determination. "Dad, I've spent my whole life trying to meet your expectations, trying to make you proud. But I can't keep doing that at the cost of my own happiness. You might think Brandon isn't good enough, but I know he is. And if you can't see that, then maybe the problem isn't with him. It's with you." Richard's shoulders sagged slightly, his anger giving way to something more vulnerable. For the first time, he looked unsure. "Betty, I don't want to see you get hurt." "You're the one hurting me," Betty said, her voice breaking slightly. "You're the one making me feel like I have to choose between you and the person I love." The room fell silent. Richard looked at his daughter, then at Brandon, who met his gaze without flinching. Finally, Richard exhaled, his hands dropping to his sides. "I need some air," he muttered, turning and walking out of the cafe. The three of them stood in silence for a moment after Richard left. Sarah was the first to speak. "You handled that beautifully," she told Betty, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thanks, Mom," Betty said quietly, though her eyes were still on the door. Brandon finally spoke, his voice soft. "Are you okay?" Betty turned to him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. I am now. Brandon reached out, taking her hand. I'm proud of you. She smiled, squeezing his hand. Thank you for letting me handle it. You didn't need me to fight for you, Brandon said. You've always been strong enough to do that yourself. Betty looked at him, her heart full despite the confrontation. I love you. I love you too, Brandon said, his voice steady. Sarah cleared her throat, a small smile playing on her lips. I'll leave you two to talk. I think I'll go check on your father. As Sarah left the cafe, Betty and Brandon sat back down at their table. The storm of the confrontation had passed, but they both knew there were more challenges ahead. Richard Thompson sat at his desk in the precinct, staring blankly at the stack of reports in front of him. The voices of his colleagues murmured in the background, but he barely registered the noise. His name, once synonymous with respect and authority in the department, was now the subject of whispered conversations and skeptical glances. The investigation into his conduct had started quietly, a formal complaint about his behavior during a routine traffic stop. But as the weeks went on, more reports surfaced. Complaints of overreach, bias, and unprofessionalism painted a damning picture. What stung most wasn't just the accusations. It was the realization that people who had once admired him were now questioning his integrity. Detective Michael Harris, a longtime colleague, knocked on the doorframe before stepping inside. Got a minute, Thompson? Richard nodded, his voice hoarse. Yeah. Close the door. Harris did as asked, taking a seat across from Richard's desk. He looked at him carefully, his expression a mix of sympathy and professionalism. I wanted to talk to you before the board does. Richard tensed. So it's gotten that far. Harris nodded. You know how it works. Once a complaint triggers an internal review, every decision you've made gets scrutinized. And, well, the pattern is hard to ignore. Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. A pattern. That's what they're calling it. Harris sighed. Look, I'm not here to lecture you. But you've been harder on some people than others, and it's not sitting well. The board will want answers. Richard's voice turned defensive. I've always done my job, Harris. I've always enforced the law. Sure, Harris said, leaning forward. But the law isn't about bending people to your will. It's about fairness. And lately, it seems like you've been letting personal biases get in the way. Richard's jaw tightened. You think I'm biased? Harris didn't flinch. I think you've been through a lot. And maybe somewhere along the way, you started seeing people as threats instead of individuals. But that's not an excuse, Richard. You know better. The words hit harder than Richard expected. He didn't respond, staring at the desk instead. After a moment, Harris stood. Take a good look at yourself, man. This investigation doesn't have to define you, but it will if you let it. As Harris left, Richard remained still, his thoughts a tangled mess. For the first time, he felt the weight of not just the accusations but the truth behind them. At home, Sarah watched her husband from the doorway as he sat on the couch, his head in his hands. The man she had known for years, the strong, decisive figure who had commanded respect, now seemed lost. She walked over, sitting beside him quietly. What are you thinking about? She asked gently. Richard didn't look up. That I might have ruined everything. Sarah's expression softened, but her words were firm. You're not the only one hurting, Richard. But you need to stop wallowing and start asking yourself why this happened. I was just doing my job, he muttered defensively. Sarah shook her head. No. You weren't. You were using your position to project your fears onto other people. And you didn't care who got hurt along the way. Her words stung, but Richard didn't argue. Instead, he sighed deeply. I thought I was protecting Betty. I thought I was protecting our family. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. Protecting us from what? Brandon? A good man who loves our daughter? Or from the idea that maybe you're not in control of everything? Richard glanced at her, his eyes tired. I don't know anymore. That's the first honest thing you've said in a while, she said softly. Days turned into weeks as the investigation progressed. Richard was placed on administrative leave, a decision that stripped him of his badge and left him feeling untethered. Without the routine of his job, he found himself with too much time to think. He avoided the precinct, knowing the looks and whispers that would greet him. Instead, he spent his days walking the city streets, revisiting places that held memories from his past. One afternoon, he found himself standing outside Brandon's barbershop. Through the window, he saw the young man working, his focus intense as he shaped a client's hair. For the first time, Richard saw Brandon not as a threat but as a person. The determination in his movements, the care he put into his craft, it reminded Richard of his younger self when he had first joined the force, eager to make a difference. The door opened, and Jason stepped out, spotting Richard immediately. Jason froze, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. Richard held up a hand. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just looking." Jason crossed his arms. "Well, don't just look. Say what you need to say, or move along." Richard hesitated, then shook his head. "Not today." He turned and walked away, leaving Jason watching him with suspicion. One evening, as Richard sat in his home office, he opened a file on his computer labeled Complaints. It contained every report that had been filed against him during his career. He read through each one slowly, the words blurring together as shame settled in his chest. The faces of those he had treated unfairly flashed in his mind. He thought of Brandon, of the way he had belittled him, judged him, and dismissed him without ever giving him a chance. Finally, he closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "I need to fix this," he whispered to himself. "I don't know how, but I need to try." For the first time in years, Richard sought therapy. At first, the sessions were uncomfortable, confronting his own biases, acknowledging his failures. But as weeks turned into months, he began to understand the roots of his behavior, his fear of losing control, his need to impose his will on others to feel secure. "I've hurt a lot of people," he admitted during one session. "My daughter. My wife. Brandon. I don't know if they'll ever forgive me." "Forgiveness starts with accountability," his therapist replied. "And with showing, not just saying, that you're willing to change." Richard still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The man who had once wielded authority like a weapon was beginning to see the value of humility. It had been months since Richard Thompson had stepped into Brandon Walker's barbershop, but this time, the circumstances were starkly different. The usually confident man now hesitated outside, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The sounds of laughter and buzzing clippers filtered through the glass door. His hand hovered near the handle before he finally pushed it open. Inside, Brandon stood at his station, finishing a haircut for a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His movements were smooth, practiced, and relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension Richard felt twisting in his chest. Jason was the first to notice Richard. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped toward Brandon. "You've got company," he said quietly, nodding toward the door. Brandon turned, his expression tightening as his gaze met Richard's. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The hum of the clippers stopped, and the soft murmur of clients quieted. Brandon handed the boy a lollipop, smiling briefly at the child before speaking. "Give me a minute, Jason." Jason hesitated but nodded, moving to another station. Brandon walked to the front, stopping a few feet away from Richard. "What brings you here, Mr. Thompson?" His voice was steady but cautious. Richard cleared his throat, suddenly hyper-aware of every curious glance in the shop. I'd like to talk. If you're willing." Brandon glanced around the room, then nodded toward the waiting area. "All right. Over here." Richard followed him, sitting awkwardly on one of the leather chairs. Brandon remained standing, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead." "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened between us," Richard began, his voice low. "About the things I said. The way I treated you." Brandon didn't respond, his silence urging Richard to continue. "I was wrong," Richard admitted, the words heavy but sincere. "I judged you unfairly. I let my pride, my biases, and my fear get in the way of seeing who you really are. I hurt you, and I hurt my daughter in the process." Brandon's gaze didn't waver, but his posture softened slightly. "Why now?" he asked. "Why come here after all this time?" Richard exhaled, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Because I've been trying to make things right. And I know that starts with facing the people I've wronged." Brandon's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing. He remembered every slight, every insult, every moment Richard had tried to tear him down. But he also thought of Betty and the pain this rift had caused her. Finally, he spoke. "Apologies don't erase the past." "No, they don't," Richard agreed. "But I'm hoping they can be the first step toward something better." The tension in the room was palpable. Jason, from across the shop, watched the interaction with folded arms. The clients, though pretending not to listen, were clearly eavesdropping. Brandon noticed it all but didn't let it distract him. "Do you even know what you're asking for?" Brandon asked, his tone even but firm. "This isn't just about me. You hurt Betty too. You made her feel like she had to choose between us." Richard's face fell. "I know. And I hate myself for putting her in that position." "So what now?" Brandon asked, leaning back slightly. "You say sorry and we're supposed to just move on?" Richard shook his head. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm trying to change. Not just for Betty, but for myself. For all the people I've let down." Brandon studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But Richard's eyes were steady, his demeanor different from the man he'd faced months ago. After a long silence, Brandon finally spoke. "People make mistakes. It's what you do after that matters." Richard nodded. "I'm ready to do better." Brandon extended a hand. "Then start here." The handshake was firm but brief, carrying the weight of a tentative truce. Jason, unable to hold back any longer, approached. "What's going on?" Brandon glanced at him. A conversation that needed to happen. Jason raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You sure about this?" "Yeah," Brandon replied. "It's a start." Richard stood, looking between the two young men. "Thank you. Both of you. For giving me a chance." Jason didn't respond, but Brandon nodded. "Don't waste it." As Richard left the shop, the air inside felt lighter, though the weight of his words lingered. Brandon returned to his station, the faces of his clients watching him with quiet curiosity. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Who's next?" The shop buzzed back to life, but Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that the fractured pieces of their lives might one day come together. The knock on Brandon's apartment door was soft but deliberate. He knew who it was even before he opened it. Standing on the other side was Betty, her eyes searching his face, a mixture of hope and nervousness reflected in her expression. "Hi," she said, her voice gentle. "Hey," Brandon replied, stepping aside to let her in. She hesitated, taking in the familiar surroundings. The simple furniture, the faint scent of cedarwood from a candle Brandon always kept lit. It felt like stepping into a memory, one she wasn't sure she still had a right to hold. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," she admitted, folding her hands in front of her. Brandon leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Betty, you're the one person I always want to see." Her breath hitched slightly, and she nodded. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about everything. And I realized I've been holding back, not because I don't love you, but because I've been afraid." "Afraid of what?" Brandon asked, his voice steady but warm. "Afraid of failing you," she admitted. "Afraid that no matter how hard I try, I'll always be stuck between you and my dad, and that I'll never make either of you happy." Brandon closed the space between them, his hands gently resting on her arms. "Betty, your happiness isn't about choosing between us. It's about choosing what's right for you. I never wanted you to feel like you had to carry all of this alone." She looked up at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't want to carry it alone anymore. I want to carry it with you." Brandon smiled softly. "Then we start fresh. Together." The decision to rebuild their relationship wasn't without its challenges. Both Brandon and Betty knew they had work to do, not just in repairing what had been broken, but in building something stronger. They began spending time together again, each interaction a mix of laughter and vulnerability. One evening, they sat on Brandon's couch, a stack of old photos spread across the coffee table. Betty picked up a picture of them from when they first started dating. In it, they were smiling carefree, completely oblivious to the struggles that lay ahead. "Do you ever wish we could go back to this?" she asked, tracing her finger along the edge of the photo. Brandon shook his head. "No. Because everything we went through made us who we are now. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Betty smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You always know what to say." As their bond grew stronger, so did their shared purpose. Both Brandon and Betty realized they had an opportunity to use their experiences to help others. They began brainstorming ways to promote understanding and empathy in their community, drawing inspiration from the challenges they had overcome together. One night, as they sat in the shop after hours, Brandon shared an idea. What if we hosted a series of conversations here? Like, real talks about tough issues, race, privilege, relationships. A place where people can come and listen to each other without judgment. Betty's eyes lit up. I love that. And maybe we could pair it with workshops, something hands-on that brings people together. Like teaching skills or sharing stories. Brandon nodded, his excitement building. It's about creating a space where people feel seen and heard. That's something I've always wanted this shop to be. The first event took place on a quiet Saturday evening. Brandon cleared the shop floor, setting up folding chairs in a circle. Betty brought coffee and pastries from a nearby cafe, arranging them on a side table. They weren't sure how many people would show up, but as the start time approached, the room began to fill. Jason was the first to speak. I wasn't sure about this at first, he admitted, looking around the circle. But I think it's important. Too many of us go through life without really trying to understand each other. From there, the conversation flowed. People shared stories of their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. Brandon and Betty listened, chiming in when appropriate but mostly letting the group guide the discussion. By the end of the night, there was a sense of connection that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," one attendee said to Brandon as they left. This was different. In a good way. Brandon smiled. That's what we were hoping for. Word spread quickly, and the events became a regular occurrence. Each session brought new faces, new stories, and new opportunities for growth. Brandon and Betty's partnership in this endeavor only deepened their relationship, as they learned to support each other in ways they hadn't before. One evening, as they locked up the shop, Betty turned to Brandon. "Do you ever feel like we're exactly where we're supposed to be?" Brandon looked at her, his heart full. "Yeah. And it's because we got here together." Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Local media began covering their work, highlighting the impact they were having on the community. Brandon's shop became more than just a place for haircuts. It became a symbol of resilience and unity. But for Brandon, the most important outcome was the way his relationship with Betty continued to grow. Every step they took felt like a step towards something unbreakable. Richard Thompson stood in the Recreation Center's community hall, surrounded by faces that reminded him of the life he had once misunderstood. He was volunteering for a youth mentorship program, a decision that had taken months of self-reflection to reach. The kids sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they listened to his story. "I spent years thinking I had all the answers," Richard admitted, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "But the truth is, I didn't even know the right questions to ask. I made mistakes, big ones, because I was too proud to listen, too blind to see beyond my own fears." One of the teens, a boy with sharp eyes and a guarded demeanor, raised his hand. "So why are you here now?" Richard met his gaze, unflinching. "Because I want to be better. And because I owe it to people like you to admit when I was wrong and to do something about it." The room was quiet for a moment, and then another teen spoke up. "Do you really think people can change?" "I didn't used to," Richard said honestly. "But I've learned that change isn't something that just happens. It's something you fight for, every single day." Meanwhile, Betty and Brandon were busy building their own legacy. The barbershop had evolved into a vibrant hub for connection and learning. Their workshops, talks, and events had grown in scale, attracting people from all walks of life. One Saturday morning, Betty stood in front of a packed room, leading a discussion about empathy and communication. Brandon watched from the back, his chest swelling with pride as he saw her command the room with grace and authenticity. After the session ended, Betty joined Brandon at the counter. "How'd I do?" she asked, grabbing a sip of water. "You were amazing," Brandon said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "I don't know how you do it, talking to all those people like it's nothing." Betty smiled. "It's not nothing. It's everything. I want them to see what we've learned, that understanding each other is the only way forward." Brandon kissed her temple. "They're lucky to have you." "And I'm lucky to have you," Betty replied, resting her head on his shoulder. One evening, Richard made his way to Brandon's barbershop, a gift-wrapped box in hand. The shop was closed, but the lights inside glowed softly, and he could see Brandon sweeping the floor while Betty wiped down the chairs. Richard hesitated for a moment, then knocked gently on the door. Brandon glanced up, his brows lifting in surprise. He opened the door, stepping aside to let Richard in. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "what brings you by?" Richard held out the box awkwardly. A peace offering. Or, maybe a thank you. Betty looked at her father, her expression softening. Dad, you didn't have to. Yes, I did, Richard interrupted. You two gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. I can never undo the things I said or did, but I wanted you to know how much I respect what you've built here. And how proud I am of both of you. Brandon opened the box, revealing a custom plaque. It read, Walker's Barbershop, more than a cut, a place for change. Brandon's throat tightened as he read the words. This means a lot, he said, his voice steady but emotional. Richard nodded. It's the least I could do. Betty stepped forward, wrapping her father in a hug. Thank you, Dad, she said softly. For trying. Richard hugged her back, his grip firm. You're the reason I'm here, Betty. You and Brandon. Years passed, and the barbershop continued to thrive. Brandon and Betty got married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by friends and family. Richard, now a changed man, gave a heartfelt speech during the reception. To my daughter and the man who taught me more about integrity and love than I ever thought possible, he began. You've shown me what true strength looks like, not in power or control, but in compassion and resilience. I'm proud to call you family. Tears welled in Betty's eyes as she squeezed Brandon's hand. Brandon smiled, nodding at Richard. Thank you, he said simply. In the heart of Chicago, Walker's Barbershop became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could happen when people chose to see the humanity in one another. Richard continued his work with the community, sharing his story and mentoring others to avoid the mistakes he had made. His transformation inspired many, including the youth he worked with, who began to believe that change was possible, even for those who had lost their way. Brandon and Betty poured their hearts into their life together, growing not only as partners but as leaders. Their journey from struggle to triumph became a story that was told across the city, a reminder of the power of love, understanding, and the courage to confront one's own flaws. And in that story, a cycle of pain turned into a legacy of hope, proving that even in the face of adversity, change is not only possible, it's transformative.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.